In 1918, the United States was thriving. Life was good. Citizens found they had more money and leisure time than any other generation before them. In spite of the fact that the world had been at war for 4 long years, the country seemed to be prospering more than ever before. In fact, the war required the nation's women to take over men's positions, bestowing them with more rights, such as voting, and the respect they so deserved. Not only that, but the country's technology was booming as the Model T car was becoming more familiar and transportation was becoming much more painless. In addition to the flourishing economy, families found themselves attending live theater performances, films, and spending quality time at roller skating rinks, dance and pool halls, and amusement parks. Most didn't dwell on the millions of lives being lost until it was happening in their own hometowns. The good economics and thriving women's rights were quickly put on hold as a strange, sudden disease took over the country. And then the whole world. If the World War didn't end life as they knew it, the influenza would. When the 1918 influenza ravaged the world, many responsibilities were thrown onto the shoulders of public health officials to protect the rights of the citizens. It all began on March 11, 1918, and for most living at Fort Riley, it started as any other morning would. However, a cook on the camp, Albert Gitchell, was admitted to a Kansas hospital when he came down with flu-like symptoms and a temperature of 103. By midday, 107 cases had been reported. The same situation repeated in Army camps dispersed around the country, and eventually to the rest of the world, ending approximately 5 times as many lives as the war. Thankfully for Gitchell, the strain was theorized to be linked to an outbreak that had occurred previously in China. Although the exact origins are unknown, it spread around the whole world like wildfire, only leaving an island off the coast of Brazil. As the situation worsened, it was evident that the whole world had the responsibility to work together to find a way to stop the influenza in its tracks. People had the right to stay well, and the government needed to protect its citizens. However, in that era, there just wasn't the technology to battle the epidemic and create drugs and antibiotics. Germany had just created aspirin, which contributed greatly to ending the Spanish influenza, lowering people's fevers and overall saving lives.
Them that went to see the doctor, she'd just say, go home and take aspirin and drink water, any kind of liquid.
Because of the lack of drugs, people experimented with their own home remedies, some of which did seem to help the situation.
There were 2 enormously important things going on at once, and they were at right angles to each other. One, of course, was the influenza epidemic, which dictated that you should sort of shut everything down, and the war, which demanded that everything should speed up, that certainly the factories should continue operating, you should continue to have bond drives, soldiers should be drafted, sent to the camps, jammed into barracks, put on boats and with bunks 6 high and sent off to France. One of the great tragedies of the situation is that there was no correct thing to do. You can't look back and say, if our officials had only done the correct thing. There wasn't any correct thing to do.
Even though the government didn't have the sort of technology they have today, in an attempt to figure out the mystery behind the influenza, the Rockefeller Institute intended to create a hospital completely for the investigation of the disease. It was only available for those suffering from the influenza, and they were admitted at no cost. Richard Shope was a physician at the Institute who was awarded with the 1957 Albert Lasker Clinical Medical Research Award when he discovered the link between human and swine influenzas. In the event of a reoccurrence, not only does the government have the responsibility to supply drugs or antibiotics to the people, but the private drug companies must also work to improve their medications and supply the country with the treatments they need. Because of the lack of medications to fight the disease and the fact that the war was still raging on, there was a controversy about shutting things down or to keep going.
Church up here at that time, but the school was closed. There wasn't no school. They had to close it. There was nobody. The teachers would even see.
Still, people felt the right to be able to go outside or just to the grocery store without dying because of it. The gauze masks were first introduced in hospitals, when doctors and nurses wore triangles of folded gauze over their face to prevent them from breathing in the flu-infected air around them. It also prevented infected people from expelling droplets from their mouths. Though rarely worn in public in most towns, in San Francisco it was a requirement to wear the masks.
We know now how flu spreads. It spreads by breath. It spreads through the air, which is why it moves so fast. To get typhoid, you have to drink infected water. But with influenza, all you have to breathe in is to breathe in while somebody else is breathing out. If you're on a subway car in an elevator with somebody with influenza who sneezes, that air will be utterly full of viruses, and you will breathe them in unless you can manage to hold your breath for X number of minutes. I don't think there's any disease that moves any faster than through a population than influenza, because it is perfectly adapted to be breath-borne.
The American Public Health Association prohibited unnecessary gatherings and funerals because they were avoidable assemblies.
My father and Uncle Eli, whom we called his manservant, dug a common grave and buried 3 people in it: mother, father, and a young daughter.
Nearly everyone was becoming ill, including the undertakers.
The undertakers just ran, I don't know how many, into their wagon and took them to the cemetery. That was it. And had to dig your own grave. I mean, the families had to dig their own graves. Grave diggers was sick. And it was just, well, that was the terrible thing.
Even though there weren't many resources available, doctors and nurses were still held responsible for caring for the sick and dying. When they fell ill, the families that had been fortunate enough to stay well were deemed nurses themselves.
I was 10 years old, and my family was the only family in the little town that did not contact the flu. Therefore, my parents became automatic nurses.
Those who were ill had the responsibility to prevent others from contracting the flu. For those who weren't, had the right to stay well. People who lived in a household that was infected had a red card that read influenza on the door, which prevented those other than doctors, nurses, or officials from entering, and individuals in such houses couldn't leave to go anywhere other than to work. Today, the influenza still affects the entire world, and smaller-scale epidemics have happened since 1918. However, it hasn't killed millions like it did nearly 100 years ago. Since then, much research has been completed and new drugs have been formed. Along with the responsibility to prevent another epidemic, the government must also make sure that their methods are safe. In 1976, when the swine flu appeared, the national influenza immunization was put into act and vaccinated more than 36 million people before it was terminated because of a link to a neurological condition. Now people have the right to become vaccinated against the influenza. However, they also have the right not to because of problems that have come hand in hand with the vaccination. Though, to keep our country safe, everyone has the responsibility to protect themselves.
The thing I could suggest about that is to be aware that it could happen again. Children need to learn about what could happen. Of course, I'm sure hospitals are aware.
Thankfully, today the United States has a detailed national strategy for pandemic influenza that prepares the federal government for a pandemic. The plan consists of 3 pillars: 1, preparedness and communication, 2, surveillance and detection, and 3, response and containment. And although it is impossible to completely prevent another epidemic, the United States is in much better shape than it ever was before.